A 17-year-old boy, barefoot, with his hands bound by a rope of vegetable fiber, walking behind a line of camels loaded with spices. 3 days before, he was the favorite son of a rich man. Now he is merchandise. Genesis 37 describes the scene with a coldness that chills. The brothers themselves negotiated the price. 20 pieces of silver. That was the value of a teenager in the Middle Eastern slave market, 3,700 years ago. To get an idea, a donkey cost 30. Joseph was worth less than a beast of burden. But here is what makes this story different from any other slavery story in the ancient world. This boy, sold as a disposable object, will become the second most powerful man in the greatest empire on the face of the earth. And the path between these 2 points, between the rope on his wrist and the gold ring of the pharaoh, passes through places you never imagined. But how is this possible? How did a Hebrew sheep shepherd, who did not speak the language, did not know the customs, and had no allies, manage not only to survive in Egypt, but to dominate the entire system? The answer is in the details that the Bible tells, and those that archaeology finally managed to fill. Let us start with the road. The path from Canaan to Egypt was not just any trail. The Ishmaelite merchants who bought Joseph followed a trade route known as the Way of Horus, a military and commercial road that cut through the Sinai Desert, connecting Gaza to the Nile Delta. It was about 400 kilometers of crossing, 10 to 15 days of marching, depending on the speed of the caravan. And Genesis gives us a seemingly small detail, but one that reveals a lot. The Ishmaelites carried gum, balm, and myrrh. They were not professional slave traders. They were merchants of spices and aromatic resins, products of extremely high value in Egypt, where they were used in the embalming of mummies and in religious rituals. Joseph was an opportunistic acquisition. They saw an easy business and bought a boy on the way. Now imagine this crossing through the eyes of Joseph, a teenager raised in the green hills of Hebron, accustomed to pastures, herds, and his father's tent. Suddenly, he is crossing the Sinai Desert on foot, sand as far as the eye can see, the sun burning his skin at more than 45 degrees during the day and at night, the temperature plummeting to near zero, his mouth dry, water rationed, each step taking him further from everything he knew. And the worst, not knowing where he was going, nor what they would do with him. After almost 2 weeks of marching, the landscape begins to change. The sand gives way to scrub vegetation, then to papyrus fields, then to something Joseph had never seen in his life. Water, not a stream, not a well. A river so wide that from the bank where he was, one could barely see the other bank. The Nile, the greatest river the ancient world knew, cutting through the desert like a living artery, its dark waters, almost black with sediment, spread out over a green strip kilometers wide in each direction. The land around the Nile was so fertile that the Egyptians called it Kemet, the Black Land. Everything there grew: wheat, barley, flax, papyrus, onions, garlic, lentils, figs, dates. While Canaan depended on rain, Egypt had something infinitely more reliable: the annual flooding of the Nile, which covered the fields with a fresh layer of nutritious silt every year. Between June and September, it was almost impossible to starve there. For a sheep shepherd from the mountains of Canaan, the first sight of Egypt must have been like landing on another planet. And it was not just nature, it was civilization. When the caravan crossed into the Nile Delta and began to approach urban centers, Joseph encountered something that simply did not exist in Canaan: real cities. Not tent camps, Not stone villages with 50 families, cities with planned streets, mud brick walls 4 meters high, temples with columns painted in vibrant colors, permanent markets with hundreds of merchants. We are talking about approximately 1700 years before Christ. At that time, Egypt was already a civilization with more than 1,000 years of history. The pyramids of Giza were already almost 900 years old. Read that again. The pyramids were already ancient when Joseph arrived. They were already tourist ruins. The Egypt of that time was what the United States is today, the greatest economic and military power in the known world, a state bureaucracy so organized that it recorded every sack of harvested grain, every head of cattle, every worker. Scribes trained from childhood controlled everything using a writing system that most other peoples could not even imagine. And it was into this system, this machine of control and efficiency, that Joseph, a foreign slave with no name and no language, was thrown. If you agree that the hand of God was already guiding Joseph from the first step on that road, comment, God is faithful. Now let us talk about what happened when the caravan arrived at the market. Genesis 39:1 says something brief, almost casual. And Joseph was taken to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian man, bought him from the hand of the Ishmaelites. One sentence. But behind that sentence, there is an entire world that most people never stopped to visualize. Slave markets in the Egypt of the second millennium before Christ were regular and organized. They usually took place in areas near ports or the gates of large cities. The slaves were displayed on wooden or stone platforms, usually naked, or with a minimal cloth around their waist, so that buyers could evaluate their physical condition. Teeth were examined, hands were turned over to check for calluses, legs were felt to check for muscle strength. It was a veterinary exam, because that was exactly how they treated human merchandise. Joseph was 17 years old. He was young, strong, and Genesis makes a point of recording a detail that will become crucial later. He was handsome. Genesis 39:6 uses the same Hebrew expression that describes his mother Rachel, beautiful in appearance and handsome in face. In a slave market. This was a double-edged sword. It increased the price and increased the danger. Potiphar was not just any man. The biblical text calls him captain of the guard, in Hebrew, Sar Hatabahim, and here the original Hebrew hides a macabre detail. The word Tabahim comes from Taba, which literally means butcher or slaughterer. Sar Hatabahim was the chief of the executioners, the man responsible for royal executions. Today we would say that Potiphar was something between the chief of presidential security and the official state executioner, a man with the power of life and death, one of the most feared officers in all of Egypt, and it is in the house of this man that Joseph will live. Now, what was the house of a high-ranking official in Egypt like 3,700 years ago? Forget what you saw in Hollywood movies. The reality was different, and in many respects more impressive. Archaeological excavations at Tel El Daba, in the Nile Delta, a site that many researchers identify as ancient Avaris, the region where the story of Joseph likely unfolded, revealed elite residential structures that date exactly to this period. And what they found is extraordinary. The houses of high-ranking officials followed a pattern called the rectangular Egyptian mansion. They were built with sun-dried mud bricks, the same basic material as humble houses, but on a completely different scale. We are talking about properties with 10, 15, even 20 rooms distributed around open internal courtyards. The floors were covered with a layer of smooth and polished mortar. The inner walls were plastered and painted, not with simple paint, but with frescoes that depicted scenes of the Nile, birds, lotus and papyrus plants in blue, green, red, and yellow. The colors were extracted from ground minerals, malachite for green, lapis lazuli for blue, ochre for red. They were expensive pigments. Having painted walls was a sign of status as clear as having an imported car in the garage today. The roof was made of palm logs covered with reed mats and a thick layer of mud. It functioned as thermal insulation. It kept the interior cool during the day, when the temperature outside exceeded 40 degrees, and retained the heat during the cold nights of the desert. The windows were narrow and positioned at the top of the walls, designed to allow air circulation, without letting in direct sunlight or sand carried by the wind. And here comes a detail that surprises. These houses had bathrooms. Not bathrooms like ours, of course, but specific rooms, with limestone seats over trenches that were cleaned by domestic slaves. They also had bathing areas with sloping floors for water drainage. The Egyptian elite bathed daily, something that Europe would only rediscover 3,000 years later. The Egyptian obsession with bodily cleanliness was so strong that Herodotus, when he visited Egypt in the 5th century before Christ, more than 1,000 years after Joseph, was still shocked by how much the Egyptians washed themselves. It is in this environment that Joseph was inserted, an environment of luxury, order, and sophistication, but not as a guest, as property. He was a domestic slave, and being a domestic slave in a high-ranking Egyptian house meant waking up before the sun rose and only stopping when the last oil lamp was extinguished. The tasks of a domestic slave included preparing the Lord's table, and the table of a man like Potiphar was not simple. Paintings in tombs from the period show banquets with roasted geese, Nile fish grilled on bronze skewers, conical-shaped breads made with emmer flour, thick beer served in ceramic jars, figs, dates, pomegranates, and grapes. The smell of animal fat roasting in charcoal braziers, mixed with the sweet aroma of fruits and the sourness of fermenting beer. This was the olfactory landscape that surrounded Joseph every day. But the slaves did not eat this food. The diet of a domestic slave was coarse bread, raw onions and diluted beer, sometimes leftovers. It was enough to keep the body working, but not much more than that. Joseph would also have been responsible for maintaining the house's stocks, organizing the food warehouse, supervising deliveries of grain and oil, and keeping a record of everything that came in and out. And it is exactly here that something extraordinary begins to happen. Genesis 39:3-4 records a change that in the context of ancient Egypt is almost unbelievable. His Lord saw that the Lord was with him, and that everything he did, the Lord made prosper in his hand. Joseph found favor in his eyes and served him, and he set him over his house, and all that he had, he delivered into his hand. Potiphar promoted Joseph to general administrator of the house. The Hebrew term is pakad, supervisor in charge. In Egyptian terms, Joseph became what documents of the time call imi raper, the one who supervises the house. It was the highest position a servant could occupy. The administrator controlled finances, stocks, slaves, land, cattle, everything. To understand the absurdity of this, imagine the scene. A foreigner, a Hebrew, a slave bought in the market, and suddenly he is giving orders to free Egyptians inside the house of one of the most powerful officers in the kingdom. This did not happen. Egyptian society was one of the most hierarchical and xenophobic in the ancient world. The Egyptians called foreigners vile Asiatics in hieroglyphs Amu, a term loaded with contempt. Official texts of the period describe the peoples of Canaan as barbarians, dirty, unreliable, and in the midst of this institutionalized prejudice, a teenage Canaanite was placed in command of a general's house. What did Joseph do to win this position? The Bible gives the credit to God. The Lord was with him. But divine providence worked through very concrete skills. Joseph knew how to manage. Remember, he was the son of Jacob, a man who controlled huge herds, negotiated with local kings, and managed an entire clan. Joseph grew up watching resource management in real time. He knew how to count, calculate, organize. And here comes the factor that almost no one mentions: the language. Joseph did not arrive in Egypt speaking Egyptian. He spoke a Canaanite dialect, a Semitic language, completely different from the Egyptian language, which belonged to another linguistic trunk. The two languages had almost nothing in common. It was like throwing a Brazilian in the middle of China without a translator. But when Genesis describes Joseph talking to Potiphar, with Potiphar's wife, with the jailer, and later with Pharaoh himself, it is clear that at some point he learned Egyptian fluently. He learned by immersion, day by day, obeying orders that at first he probably only understood by gestures. A slave who does not understand commands does not last long in an Egyptian house. The punishment for disobedience was physical and immediate. Survival forced Joseph to absorb the language at maximum speed. And it was not just the spoken language. To manage an elite house in Egypt, Joseph needed to deal with written records. The Egyptians documented absolutely everything: grain delivery receipts, livestock inventories, ration lists for workers, official correspondence. Everything was recorded on papyrus rolls or on ostraca, which were ceramic shards used as disposable notepads. Did Joseph learn to read and write in hieratic, the cursive Egyptian script used in day-to-day life? We are not absolutely sure, but logic says yes. You do not manage a general's property without reading the documents that arrive and leave the house. Think about what this means. In a few years, Joseph went from an illiterate sheep shepherd, in the Egyptian sense, to a bilingual administrator capable of operating within the most sophisticated bureaucracy on the planet. This is not a minor detail. It is a monstrous intellectual feat. But here is the twist that changed everything. Just when Joseph had achieved stability, respect, and a position that 99% of slaves would never dream of reaching, a threat emerged from where he least expected. It did not come from an enemy. It did not come from a rival. It came from inside his own house. And what happened next? It destroyed everything Joseph had built and threw him into a place even worse than the slave market, where his story in Egypt began. Genesis 39:7, 7 words in Hebrew that changed the course of the entire narrative. His Lord's wife cast her eyes on Joseph. The text does not say she fell in love, does not say she felt attraction, says she cast her eyes, in Hebrew. Vatisa et ainaiha is an expression of predatory desire. She saw, she wanted, and she decided to take. And here it is necessary to understand the cultural context, to realize the size of the danger Joseph was facing. In ancient Egypt, elite women had a social freedom that did not exist in practically any other civilization of the time. Upper-class Egyptian women could own property, initiate legal proceedings, conduct business, and even ask for a divorce, rights that European women would only achieve thousands of years later. Potiphar's wife was not a submissive woman, locked in a harem. She was a woman with power, with influence, and with the certainty that her word was worth more than that of any slave. Joseph said no, and he did not say it once. He said it several times. Genesis records that she insisted day after day. This was not a moment's temptation. It was a campaign. And each of Joseph's refusals was a humiliation for her. In ancient Egypt, a slave refusing the lady of the house was more than a personal offense. It was a reversal of hierarchy that challenged the entire social order. If this level of courage and integrity impresses you, like now for more people to know this story, until the day came that Genesis describes in slow motion. The house was empty. All the servants had left. It was just her and him. She grabbed Joseph by the garment. The Hebrew text uses the word begged, which refers to the linen tunic that domestic slaves wore in Egypt. And Joseph did the only thing he could do. He ran, dropped the garment in her hands, and ran out of the house, naked or half-naked, a slave fleeing through the door of an Egyptian general's mansion. And it is at this moment that the story takes one of the cruelest turns in the whole Bible. Potiphar's wife was left with the physical proof in her hand, Joseph's tunic, and used this proof to invert the narrative. She screamed, called the other servants, and said exactly the opposite of what happened. "See, my husband brought a Hebrew to play with us. He came to me to lie with me, and I screamed. When he heard my scream, he dropped the garment and fled." Stop at the cruel intelligence of the accusation. She does not just attack Joseph, she attacks Potiphar. "My husband brought a Hebrew to play with us." She turns Potiphar into an accomplice, guilty of bringing danger into the house. With this, she neutralizes any chance Potiphar has of defending Joseph. If he defends the slave, he is admitting that his wife is a liar. And in ancient Egypt, an officer who does not control his own house loses public credibility. Potiphar was cornered, and the result? Joseph was arrested, thrown into what Genesis calls the prison house, the place where the king's prisoners were locked up. It was not a common prison. It was the royal prison, where political prisoners, officers who fell out of favor, those accused of crimes against the crown were kept. And here there is a detail that almost no one realizes. Potiphar did not have Joseph killed. Under Egyptian law, a slave accused of trying to assault his lord's wife would be summarily executed, without trial, without appeal. Potiphar had the power and the right to kill Joseph on the spot, but he did not. He sent him to prison. Why? Many scholars believe that Potiphar knew. He knew the wife's story was not true, but he could not ignore the public accusation without destroying his own reputation. So, he chose the middle ground, severe punishment, but not fatal. Joseph survived because even the man who condemned him knew he was innocent. And it is from this prison, from this dark, damp hole underground, that the most extraordinary part of Joseph's story in Egypt will begin. Because what happened inside those stone walls was not just survival, it was the birth of something that would change the destiny of an entire nation. But what was a prison in Egypt like 3,700 years ago? Forget the cells with iron bars that you imagined. Archaeology paints a very different and much worse picture. Middle Kingdom Egyptian prisons were underground or semi-underground structures excavated below ground level. Administrative documents found in Lahun and Thebes use the term Kenneret to describe these locations, a word that carries the idea of confinement and restriction. They were dark spaces, with little or no ventilation, where prisoners were chained by the ankles with bronze shackles or tied with papyrus fiber ropes so tight they cut the skin. The psalm makes direct reference to this when it speaks of Joseph. His feet they hurt with fetters. He was laid in iron. The Hebrew word for iron in this verse is barzel, iron itself. And here is a fact that hurts. In the Egypt of the second millennium before Christ, iron was rarer and more valuable than gold. Iron shackles were reserved for important prisoners. Joseph was not in just any cell. He was in the cell for the dangerous ones. The darkness was almost total. Oil lamps were a luxury that prisoners did not receive. The only light came from narrow openings in the ceiling, slits that during the day let in a thread of light, and during the night let in nothing. The floor was packed earth. The smell was what you imagine when you put dozens of men together in an enclosed space without a sewage system. Sweat, urine, feces, infected wounds. Egyptian medical records from the Edwin Smith Papyrus describe skin infections. dysentery and intestinal parasites as common problems among prisoners. The life expectancy inside a kenneret was not long. Many entered and simply did not come out. And it was in this environment, in this pit of darkness and despair, that Joseph, for the second time in his life, did the impossible. Genesis 39:21 repeats almost word for word what it had already said about Potiphar's house. The Lord was with Joseph and extended his kindness to him and gave him grace in the eyes of the chief jailer. And what happens next is a pattern that by now you already recognize. The chief jailer delivered all the prisoners into Joseph's hands. Everything that was done there, Joseph was the one who managed. Again, the same phenomenon. The slave who became an administrator is now the prisoner who became the manager of the prison. Think about what that required. Joseph was not managing a stock of grain or a banquet schedule. He was managing desperate men, political prisoners, former officers who lost the favor of Pharaoh, defeated generals, administrators accused of corruption, royal or invented conspirators, dangerous people, people who had nothing to lose, and Joseph needed to maintain order among them, distribute food, resolve conflicts, decide who slept where, who received medical treatment and who did not. It was a job that required diplomacy, firmness, and a capacity for reading people that few possess. And it is exactly this capacity that will be tested in the episode that follows. One of the most well-known and least understood chapters of the entire story of Joseph, Genesis 40, begins with a seemingly simple sentence. After these things, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and the baker offended their lord. The king of Egypt. Cupbearer and baker seem like modest positions. Did they not? The cupbearer of Pharaoh in Egyptian, Nesubite, was one of the most prestigious positions in the court. He was not a waiter. He was the man responsible for the king's food safety. He tasted every cup of wine before Pharaoh drank. Every sip that passed through Pharaoh's lips passed first through the lips of the cupbearer. This meant that Pharaoh trusted this man with his own life, in modern terms. The cupbearer was a combination of sommelier, bodyguard, and personal advisor. He had direct access to Pharaoh in intimate moments, during meals, during parties, during private meetings. He knew secrets. He heard conversations. He was in practice one of the best informed men in Egypt. And the chief baker in Egyptian, Retet, occupied an equally critical position. He supervised the production of all the food that Pharaoh consumed. The royal Egyptian bakeries were not small. Paintings and tombs from the period show industrial operations with dozens of workers, producing more than 40 different types of breads and cakes. Breads with honey, with dates, with sesame seeds, ceremonial cakes in the shape of sacred animals. The chief baker controlled all of this, and any error, any suspicion of poisoning, any flaw in quality fell directly on his head. These two men had fallen out of favor. The biblical text does not explain exactly what they did, and this ambiguity is probably intentional. But Egyptian history is full of documented cases of palace conspiracies involving exactly these positions. The Turin judicial papyrus, although it is from a later period, records a harem conspiracy where officials of the royal kitchen were accused of participating in an assassination attempt on Pharaoh by poisoning. Cupbearers and bakers had access, and access is opportunity. Whether they were guilty or innocent, the simple fact of being under suspicion was already a sentence in ancient Egypt. Pharaoh's suspicion was almost as fatal as conviction, and there they were, two of the most powerful men in the Egyptian court, sharing the same cold stone space with a Hebrew slave, and Joseph was assigned to serve them. Genesis 44 says the chief jailer put Joseph with them and he served them. But Joseph was not a passive servant. He was an observer, And one specific morning, he noticed something that any other jailer would have ignored. Genesis 46 records. Joseph came to them in the morning and looked at them and saw that they were troubled. He noticed the expression on their faces. In an environment where everyone is miserable, Joseph managed to distinguish a different, specific trouble. And instead of continuing with his tasks, he stopped and asked, "Why are your faces so sad today?" This question seems trivial, does it not? It is the question of a leader. It is the question of someone who sees people, not prisoners. And the answer he received opened the door to the event that years later would place Joseph before the throne of Pharaoh. The two had dreamed, each with his own dream, on the same night. And they were troubled because in Egypt, dreams were considered divine messages, direct communications from the gods that needed to be interpreted by specialized priests. There even existed an Egyptian dream interpretation manual, the Chester Beatty Papyrus, which dates approximately to this period. It was a huge catalog that listed dreams and their meanings. If a man sees himself in a dream eating crocodile meat, good. It means he will become an officer. If a man sees himself drinking hot beer, bad. It means that suffering will come upon him. The Egyptians took dreams seriously, mortally seriously, and there in prison. The cupbearer and the baker did not have access to any priest, to any official interpreter. They were in the dark, literally and figuratively. Joseph said something that defines the man he became. "I do not interpretations belong to God. Tell them to me." Notice, he did not say, "I interpret dreams." He did not self-promote. He said that interpretations belong to God, and then offered himself as an instrument. It was faith without arrogance. It was confidence without presumption. The cupbearer spoke first. In his dream, there was a vine with 3 branches. The branches sprouted, blossomed, and produced ripe grapes. The cupbearer took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. Joseph interpreted immediately. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will restore the cupbearer to his position. He will return to serving Pharaoh's cup as he did before. And then Joseph did something deeply human. He asked for a favor. "Remember me when it is well with you. Show kindness to me and make mention of me to Pharaoh and bring me out of this house. Because indeed, I was stolen from the land of the Hebrews, and neither here have I done anything that they should put me in this dungeon." It is the first time in the biblical narrative that we hear Joseph's voice speaking about himself, and what he says is devastating. "I was stolen. I did not do anything wrong. Get me out of here." Behind the unshakable faith, behind the supernatural competence, there was a man in his early 20s who wanted to go home, who wanted to see his father, who missed everything he lost. The baker heard the favorable interpretation of the cupbearer and cheered up. He told his own dream. 3 baskets of bread on my head, in the top basket, all kinds of baked food for Pharaoh. But the birds came and ate the breads from the basket. Joseph listened. And this time the answer was not good. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will take your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh from you. Silence. Imagine the weight of that silence in the dark cell. The baker had just heard the date of his own death. 3 days. And Joseph had to say this looking into his eyes. He did not soften. He did not invent a milder version. He said the truth, even when the truth was unbearable. This also defines Joseph's character. The integrity that prevented him from yielding to Potiphar's wife is the same integrity that prevented him from lying to a condemned man. 3 days later, everything happened exactly as Joseph said. It was Pharaoh's birthday, an event of enormous ceremonial importance in Egypt called Mesuet Nesu, the day of the king's birth. On this day, Pharaoh traditionally exercised his royal prerogative to grant grace or apply justice. It was a demonstration of divine power, because Pharaoh was considered a living god, and on the day of his birth, he decided who lived and who died. The cupbearer was restored to his position. He returned to placing the cup in Pharaoh's hand, and the baker was executed, hanged on a tree, exactly as Joseph said, and the cupbearer. Genesis records 3 words that cut like a blade. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph. He forgot the man Joseph served, that Joseph comforted, that Joseph saved from anguish with a precise interpretation. This man returned to the palace, returned to luxury, returned to the life before, and simply erased Joseph from his memory. Not out of malice, probably out of convenience. Mentioning Joseph would mean explaining the prison, explaining the dream, explaining that a Hebrew slave did what no Egyptian priest was present to do. It was easier to forget. And now comes the cruelest part of the entire story of Joseph, a part that many sermons rush, that many movies cut, that many readers pass by without feeling the real weight. Genesis 41 begins with 4 words that hide an eternity of suffering. At the end of 2 full years, 2 years, 730 days, 17,500 hours, Joseph remained in prison for 2 more years after the cupbearer was released. 2 years waiting, years waking up every morning in the dark, in the cold, in the smell, thinking, will the cupbearer remember today? Will someone come down those stairs today and say my name? And no one came. Day after day after day, no one came. Try to feel this, not as a verse, as lived life. Joseph had been sold by his brothers at 17, served in Potiphar's house for probably 4 to 6 years. He had been in prison for at least 2 years after the dreams of the cupbearer and the baker, and probably more time before that. When the door finally opened, Joseph was approximately 30 years old. Genesis confirms this age. 30 years, 13 years between the pit in Dothan and the moment that comes next. 13 years of slavery, of false accusations, of prison, of forgotten promises. And at no moment, in no single verse, does the text record Joseph cursing God, abandoning faith or giving up, and then, on a night like any other in the royal palace, Pharaoh dreamed, and this dream changed the history of the ancient world. 7 fat cows came out of the Nile, beautiful, well-fed, with shiny fur and grazed at the riverbank. Then, 7 lean cows came out of the same river, ugly, skeletal, with ribs marking the skin, and the lean cows devoured the fat ones. They swallowed the 7 fat cows and remained lean. Pharaoh woke up, slept again, and dreamed again. 7 ears of wheat full, thick and golden, grew on a single stalk. Then 7 withered, dry, scorched ears by the east wind. The terrible Kamzin wind of the desert sprouted and swallowed the 7 full ears. Pharaoh woke up troubled, and here it is necessary to understand why these dreams terrified the most powerful man on earth. In Egypt, Pharaoh was not just a political ruler. He was an incarnated god, the living manifestation of Horus, the son of Ra, and the gods communicated with their equals through dreams. A dream of Pharaoh was not just any nightmare. It was an oracle, a divine message that needed to be deciphered at the risk of national catastrophe. If Pharaoh dreamed and did not understand, it meant that the gods were speaking and he was not listening. This was a religious and political crisis at the same time. Pharaoh summoned all of them. Genesis 41:8 uses two categories, Chartumim and Chakamim. The Chartumim were the magician priests, experts in rituals, incantations, and interpretation of divine signs. The Chakamim were the wise men, the intellectual advisors of the court. The spiritual and intellectual elite of the entire Egypt was gathered in a rush, and none of them managed to interpret the dreams. None of them. Think about what this means politically. Pharaoh is exposed. The gods sent a message, and the entire religious apparatus of the state, the men who justified the divine power of Pharaoh, failed. If the priests cannot interpret the dreams of the god king, the spiritual authority of the throne is in check. The palace must have been in silent panic. Officers exchanging nervous looks, priests sweating cold. And at this exact moment of institutional despair, the cupbearer finally remembered. Genesis 41:9 records even the guilt in his voice. I remember my faults today. Today. Not yesterday. Not last week. Not in the previous 730 days. Today. And he told Pharaoh about the Hebrew slave in prison, who interpreted dreams with absolute precision. Pharaoh did not hesitate. He sent for Joseph immediately, and the speed of the royal command was frightening. When Pharaoh said now, it meant now. Genesis compresses in one sentence a complete physical transformation. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon. And he shaved himself, and changed his clothes, and came in unto Pharaoh. He shaved and changed clothes. It seems like a trivial detail, does it not? No foreigner could appear before Pharaoh with a beard or with foreign clothes. The Egyptians shaved all body hair, head, face, arms, chest. They wore elaborate wigs and fine white linen clothes. Appearing bearded before Pharaoh would be a religious offense. Body hair was associated with impurity and barbarian cultures. So Joseph, in a matter of minutes, was ripped from a dark cell, shaved from head to toe, dressed in clean linen, and placed standing before the most powerful man in the world. Try to imagine the sensory contrast from a dark underground hole to Pharaoh's throne room. Columns of stone painted blue, red and gold rising to the ceiling. The floor of polished alabaster, reflecting the light of dozens of bronze torches. The smell of myrrh, incense, and frankincense burning in ceremonial braziers. Guards with bronze spears lined up on the sides. Priests with shaved heads and gold necklaces. And in the center of it all, sitting on an elevated throne, wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, with the crook and flail crossed over his chest. The Pharaoh. Joseph was barefoot on a cold floor, with his skin still burning from the blade that had just scraped away years of beard. His eyes accustomed to the darkness of the prison, probably burned with the light. And before him was the man who, with a single word, could send him back to the hole he came from, or send him to a place even worse. Pharaoh spoke directly. I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. And Joseph's answer at that moment is one of the most courageous sentences in the whole Bible. It is not in me. God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace. It is not in me. Taku, before the man who considered himself a living God. Joseph said that the power belonged to another God, not to Pharaoh, not to the priests who failed, not to the entire Egyptian religion, to another God, a foreign God, the God of a Hebrew slave. In the Egyptian theological context, this statement was almost suicidal. It was telling Pharaoh that his gods were insufficient, that the entire religious system that sustained the political power of the throne could not handle it, and that the answer would come from a source that Egypt despised. But Joseph said this without arrogance, without provocation. He said it with the calmness of someone who really believed it. And Pharaoh, this is the most surprising fact, was not offended. He told the dreams, and Joseph interpreted without hesitation. The 7 fat cows and the 7 full ears are 7 years of plenty. The 7 lean cows and the 7 withered ears are 7 years of famine. There will come 7 years of great abundance throughout all the land of Egypt. And after them will arise 7 years of famine so severe that all the abundance will be forgotten. The famine will consume the land, and the fact that the dream came twice, cows and ears, means that the thing is determined by God, and God is hastening to do it. And then Joseph did something no one asked. No one asked for advice. Pharaoh asked for an interpretation, but Joseph did not stop at the interpretation. He presented a plan. Let Pharaoh look for a man discerning and wise and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this. Let him appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 years of plenty. Let them gather all the food of those good years that are coming and store up grain under the hand of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. Thus the food shall be for a supply for the land during the 7 years of famine. Are you hearing what Joseph did? A prisoner just taken out of the dungeon had just presented to Pharaoh a complete economic program, a plan of taxation, storage, and distribution that would save Egypt from collapse. And it was not a vague plan. It was specific. 20% tax on agricultural production during the years of abundance. Centralization of stocks under state control. Distribution managed during the crisis. It was first world fiscal policy proposed by a slave without title, without land, and without name. And Pharaoh immediately recognized the genius of what he was hearing. Genesis 39 records the reaction. Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you." And what happened next is the fastest and most unlikely rise in the history of the ancient world. In a single hearing, Joseph went from prisoner to second most powerful man in Egypt. Pharaoh took the signet ring from his own hand and put it on Joseph's hand. The signet ring in Egyptian, Jet, was the official seal of the state. Whoever carried Pharaoh's ring could sign decrees, authorize transactions, and issue orders in the name of the king. It was literally the signature of power. He clothed Joseph in garments of fine linen, chaise, the royal linen, so fine that it was almost transparent, reserved exclusively for the royal family and the highest officials. He put a gold chain around his neck. The Shebu collar, the gold of honor, was the highest decoration that Pharaoh could grant. Reliefs in temples and tombs show Pharaoh in person, placing these necklaces around the necks of victorious generals and officers of exceptional merit. And he made Joseph ride in the second royal chariot, and they cried out before him, "Abrek," a word that probably means kneel down or pay attention. The same Egyptian crowd that would spit on a Hebrew slave in the street now bowed before him. Pharaoh gave Joseph an Egyptian name, Zaphanath-Paneah. Egyptologists debate the exact meaning, but the most accepted interpretation is, God speaks and he lives, or the man who knows things. And he gave him a wife, Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. On was Heliopolis, the center of the cult of the sun god Ra, the most important temple in Egypt. Joseph married the daughter of one of the most powerful men in the Egyptian religious hierarchy. The Hebrew slave was now part of the priestly elite by marriage. 13 years before, Joseph was at the bottom of a dry pit in Dothan, listening to his brothers decide if they would kill or sell him. Now he was wearing Pharaoh's ring. And now begins the part of the story that archaeologists can almost touch. Joseph went out throughout the whole of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. And when the text says, "He went out throughout all the land," it is not a figure of speech. Middle Kingdom Egypt had an administrative infrastructure that covered from the Nile Delta to the first cataract in Aswan, more than 1,000 kilometers of extension. Joseph traveled this corridor of fertility, organizing the largest grain storage program that the ancient world ever saw. The harvests during the 7 years were so absurd that Genesis uses a metaphor that says it all. Joseph gathered very much grain, like the sand of the sea, until he ceased to count, for it was immeasurable. Ceased to count. The most sophisticated administrative system in the ancient world. The Egyptian scribes who counted everything, who recorded every sack of grain, every liter of beer, every meter of linen, reached a point where they simply gave up counting. The granaries that Joseph probably used already existed in the Egyptian system. They were structures called shenu, built in a circular or rectangular shape, with mud bricks and straw, elevated on stone platforms to avoid humidity and rats. But the scale of what Joseph did had no precedent. He did not just fill the existing granaries, he centralized the system. Every city became a depot. Every region had its stocks monitored. 20% of everything that Egypt produced during 7 years was confiscated, transported and stored under direct state control. And during these years of abundance, while Egypt grew fat under his command, Joseph lived something that he never imagined he would live again. Normality. He had a house, a wife and 2 children. The first he called Manasseh. In Hebrew, Manash, which means God has made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. Notice the pain inside the name. The act of naming the child was an act of attempt at healing. Forget. Forget the brothers. Forget the pit. Forget 13 years of nightmare. The second child he called Ephraim, which means God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Land of my affliction. Even now, as the second most powerful man in Egypt, married to the daughter of a priest, wearing royal linen and using Pharaoh's ring, Joseph still called Egypt the land of my affliction. You can take the man out of slavery, but slavery takes a long time to leave the man. And then the 7 years of plenty ended, and the famine came. Genesis says that famine was in all the lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. In all the lands, the famine did not only affect Egypt, it devastated the entire Fertile Crescent, Canaan, Syria, Mesopotamia, prolonged droughts, failed harvests, dying herds. Archaeology confirms that the Middle East went through several periods of severe drought during the 2nd millennium before Christ. Some decades, rivers dried up, pastures turned to dust, and in the midst of this continental collapse, Egypt, and only Egypt, had food because of a plan designed by a Hebrew slave that no one wanted to listen to 13 years before. The Egyptians began to starve and cried out to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said 5 words that sealed Joseph's authority over an entire nation. You can go to Joseph and do whatever he tells you. Peoples from all lands began to travel to Egypt in search of grain. Caravans of desperate people crossing the Sinai, descending through the delta, begging for food. And everyone passed through Joseph. And here the story folds back on itself in a way that only reality can do. Because among the caravans of hungry people who went down to Egypt, there was a group of 10 men coming from Canaan, 10 brothers. The same 10 who 22 years before threw a 17-year-old boy into a dry pit, and then sat down to eat lunch while he screamed. Jacob, the father, now over 130 years old, sent the 10 oldest sons to Egypt to buy grain, but he did not send Benjamin, the youngest, the other son of Rachel, the only blood brother that remained to Joseph. Jacob did not send Benjamin because he was afraid of losing him. He had already lost Joseph. He could not bear losing the other. The 10 arrived in Egypt and were taken before the administrator responsible for the sale of grain. Before Joseph, Genesis 42:6 describes the moment with an almost cinematic precision. Now Joseph was governor over the land, and it was he who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed down before him with their faces to the earth. She bowed down with their faces to the earth. The dream. That absurd dream that a 17-year-old boy told on a morning in Canaan, the brothers' sheaves of wheat bowing before his sheaf. 22 years later, the brothers bowed before an Egyptian official they did not recognize and had no way of recognizing. Joseph was 17 years old when they last saw him. Now he was 39. He was with a shaved head, with makeup on his eyes, dressed in royal Egyptian linen, speaking Egyptian through an interpreter, sitting on an administrative throne with Pharaoh's ring on his finger. Nothing about that man reminded them of the Hebrew boy from the pit. But Joseph recognized them immediately. He saw the faces, heard the names, and the memory of 22 years fell upon him like a wall. And here begins one of the most complex psychological sequences in the whole Bible. Joseph did not reveal himself, did not shout, did not cry, did not accuse. He spoke to them harshly. He accused them of being spies, arrested them for 3 days, and then ordered them to return to Canaan with grain, but demanded that they bring Benjamin, and he kept Simeon as a hostage. Why? Scholars debate. Some say Joseph was testing the brothers. He wanted to see if they had changed, if they would abandon Simeon as they abandoned him, if they would protect Benjamin or sacrifice him. Others say Joseph was struggling with his own pain, buying time to decide what to do. Probably it was both things, the pain and the strategy, the open wound and the brilliant mind working at the same time. But Genesis reveals what was happening under the mask of an Egyptian official, and he turned himself away from them and wept, turned away and wept, in another room, far from the eyes of the brothers. The second most powerful man in Egypt wept like a 17-year-old boy at the bottom of a pit. The brothers returned to Canaan, told Jacob everything, and the old patriarch refused to send Benjamin. "My son shall not go down with you. His brother is dead, and he is left alone. If any calamity should befall him along the way, then you would bring down my gray hair with sorrow to the grave." But the famine did not yield. The grain ran out, and Judah, the same Judah who suggested selling Joseph instead of killing him, offered himself as a personal guarantee for Benjamin's life. "I myself will be surety for him. From my hand you shall require him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him before you, then let me bear the blame before you forever." It was a changed Judah, the same man, but different. 22 years of guilt do that to a person. Jacob relented, and the 11 brothers went down to Egypt. When Joseph saw Benjamin, his blood brother, the other son of Rachel, who was a baby the last time Joseph saw him, and now was an adult man, he needed to run out of the room. Genesis. Joseph made haste, for his heart yearned for his brother, and he sought somewhere to weep, and he entered his chamber and wept there. So the second time he wept, but he still did not reveal himself. Joseph applied one last test. He had a silver cup hidden, his own cup of divination, in Benjamin's sack. He let the brothers leave and then sent guards after them, accusing them of theft. The cup was found with Benjamin. By Egyptian laws, Benjamin would be enslaved. And at that moment, Joseph was watching from the box. He was seeing what the brothers would do. Would they go away and leave Benjamin behind, like they did to him 22 years ago? Would they sacrifice another son of Rachel to save their own skin? Judah stepped forward, and the speech he gave before Joseph, Genesis 44, is considered by many scholars to be the most emotionally intense piece of prose in the entire Old Testament. Judah told Joseph about the elderly father, about how the loss of a son almost killed him, about how losing him again would be literally fatal, and said, "Now therefore, please let your servant remain instead of the young man as a slave to my Lord. And let the young man go up with his brothers. For how shall I go up to my father if the young man is not with me?" Judah offered himself as a slave so that Benjamin could be free. The man who sold a brother was willing to enslave himself to save another. This was the answer Joseph was waiting for. Genesis 45:1. Then Joseph could not restrain himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, "Make everyone go out from me." And no one stood with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. He sent everyone away, all the Egyptian officials, all the guards, all the interpreters. He was left alone with the 11 and wept. Genesis 45:2 says that he wept so loudly that the Egyptians outside heard and Pharaoh's house heard. That weeping pierced through walls. 22 years of pain, of loneliness, of unanswered questions, of late nights in the dark. Everything came out at once, and he said 2 words in Hebrew, 2 words that he had not spoken aloud for more than 2 decades. "Ani Yosef." I am Joseph. The brothers could not answer. The text says they were terrified, paralyzed. Because in that instant, the entire architecture of guilt they had carried for 22 years collapsed upon them. The brother they sold was alive and was standing before them with the absolute power to destroy them. And Joseph said something that defines not only the man, but the entire meaning of this story. "Now do not be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. To preserve life, God sent me." Joseph looked back to the pit, to the caravan of Ishmaelites, to Potiphar's house, to the false accusation, to the prison, to the 2 years forgotten, and said, "All this had a purpose. It was not an accident. It was not a waste." Each day of suffering was a step in a plan that he could not see while he lived. Joseph sent for Jacob, the old patriarch, who believed for 22 years that his son was dead, received the news, and almost did not believe. Genesis. Jacob's heart stood still because he did not believe them. Stood still. The shock almost killed a 130-year-old man. But when they saw the Egyptian chariots that Joseph sent, royal chariots, loaded with gifts, escorted by Pharaoh's guards, Jacob finally believed and said, "It is enough. Joseph, my son, is still alive. I will go and see him before I die." Jacob went down to Egypt with his entire family, 70 people in total, according to Genesis. And when Joseph went out in his chariot to meet his father in Goshen, the scene that followed is of an intensity that dispenses with any literary ornament. Genesis. Joseph made ready his chariot and went up to meet Israel his father in Goshen. And he presented himself to him, and fell on his neck, and wept on his neck a long while. A long while. Not a quick hug. Not a formal greeting. A man of almost 40 years old clinging to the neck of a father of 130, weeping like the child he was when he was ripped from home. And it is here that Joseph's story turns into something bigger than an ancient biography. Because the question that this story answers is not a question from the second millennium before Christ. It is a question of now, of today, of who is listening to this at this exact moment. The question is, can suffering that does not make sense have a purpose that I still cannot see? Joseph did not receive any explanation while he was suffering. No angel appeared in the pit, saying, "Calm down. This is part of the plan." Piuilos, no voice echoed in the prison, saying, "Hold on for 2 more years." He lived 13 years in complete darkness, without a map, without a guarantee, without a forecast. And even so, he did not give up, did not become bitter, did not let the suffering transform him into the type of person who causes suffering. When he had the power to destroy the brothers who destroyed his life, he chose to forgive. When he had the power to take revenge, he chose to feed. When he could return the evil he received, he returned good, and the result, the plan that he could not see while he lived, saved not only his family, he saved an entire nation from famine. He saved Egypt. He saved Canaan. He saved the future of a people that did not even exist as a nation yet. 3,700 years later, the sands of Egypt still guard the traces of this story. Fragments of papyrus still mention Semitic officials who served in Pharaoh's court. Scarabs with foreign names still appear in excavations in the Nile Delta. The granaries of ancient Egypt are still there, ruins of stone and brick that one day fed an empire. Because a man that everyone forgot refused to forget who he was, Joseph lived 110 years. 110. Which for the Egyptians was the number of the perfect life, the ideal age of a man blessed by the gods. He saw his grandchildren and great-grandchildren. He governed Egypt for decades and, in the end, he made one last request. He did not want to be buried in Egypt. He did not want an Egyptian tomb with hieroglyphs and offerings. He wanted his bones to be carried back to Canaan, back to the land that God promised to Abraham, back home. The boy who was ripped from home at 17 never forgot where he came from and never stopped believing that one day he would return, even if it was only in his bones. If you reached this point, click on the next video that is appearing on your screen. I set it aside, especially for those who watched this one until the end.